Hi, everyone. My name is Nathan Merkel. Welcome to the Ivory Tower podcast, where we talk a little bit about sport and society, what sport looks like within the global context, what it looks like within the American context, what we think about sport, how we experience sport, why, how do we consume sport. I really hope you enjoy the following episode, and I hope you will continue to listen down the road. Thanks. Okay, hi everyone. Thank you again for joining an episode of Rebuilding the Ivory Tower podcast. My name is Nathan Merkel, where we speak about sport and society and how it sort of impacts individuals, how it impacts us, how we consume sport differently. I'm really excited about this episode today, where I'm speaking with Mary Long, a 3-year professional within the collegiate and pro sports environment, focusing on athlete inclusion and development.
Thanks, Nathan. I'm so excited to be here and have this conversation today. I guess just a brief intro about me. I am a graduate from Columbia University. I studied international and public affairs and specialized in gender and public policy. And you might think that's a very weird major, going into sports. But what I really liked about that was the advocacy piece of it. And so I think that's why I've really been interested in pursuing roles at the intersection of sports and social impact. So just a couple of my experiences, I've been able to intern with Voice in Sport, which is a nonprofit that helps to elevate the voices of female college athletes at the collegiate level. Interned at the WNBPA, being able to help advocate for the rights of professional women basketball players, and then spent some time at the University of Illinois, like you said, working in the inclusion space and then student athlete development space. So super excited to share everything that I learned over the past few years with you, and just have a good discussion.
Yeah, it's awesome. Wonderful. Thank you so much for some of that information and that introduction. I'm really curious if you could sort of paint us a picture of what your current role is, and what sort of responsibilities you have within that role.
Yeah, so I just transitioned into a new role, going into my fourth week now. My official title is Coordinator of Success through Well-Being within Columbia University's Athletics Department. And so that role is very administrative and student facing, but I will be engaging with a lot of different stakeholders, such as the student athletes, the administrators, a lot of our campus partners, and just being able to build those relationships so that I can support our student athletes in their day-to-day activities. I'll primarily be supporting them with their academics, career, and mental health, and also being able to support like student athlete affinity groups as well. So this will be very new for me, but something that's also very exciting in addition to this is my friend has started a nonprofit called Win with Integrity. And it's the goal of that is to make sports more accessible for the youth. So he asked me to be a board member for that as well. And so I'm really excited about that. Being a board member and just being able to help build a nonprofit like from the ground up. Uh, what I really enjoy about that is we envision being able to put on clinics for the youth, being able to put on workshops that focus on social emotional learning, being able to empower young girls to continue to participate in sports and gain strong leadership skills from that, being able to fundraise some money so that we can put on those clinics, but also offer scholarships for those student athletes, and also just, having some equipment donation as well so that the young kids can have the tools that they need to be able to actually play the sports that they want to play.
Yeah.
So I feel like that was a surprise for you, but
Yeah.
I'm super excited
That's
to be doing like both things.
that's great. Yeah, I actually didn't know that. I'm really happy to hear that you got involved with that. I'm curious, have you always wanted to get involved with nonprofits, or was this sort of a spur in the moment sort of thing, or were you always wanting or passionate about participating in nonprofit organizations?
Yeah, I feel like I've always been interested in participating in nonprofit organizations just because I feel like the work and the mission that they have is to really serve like the communities that really need it.
Mhm.
And I think that's where I find a lot of my purpose is being able to make things more equitable for everyone else.
Mhm.
We have a stat on our sheet that's like on average it costs a family $800 a month for them to be able to afford having their a kid participate in a sport. And so it can get like really costly. So I feel like that's what I really enjoy is how can we make things more accessible for everyone, to bridge the gap. Especially, I think my identity also plays a factor into this. Being Asian American, we don't see a lot of representation in sports. So it's like that's one barrier for me is that identity piece. But then I know that there's like financial barriers and stuff as well. And so just kind of thinking about all these different communities of people who might not have access to it. But that's the beautiful thing about sports is that it really does bring everyone together. It helps build identities, builds communities. And so I think that's one area that I really love is sports in the nonprofit space.
Yeah. Is there anything that you're working on with this nonprofit that's coming up in the pipeline? Is there any sort of event or initiative that you're working on?
Yeah, I have so I just came on a couple weeks ago, but today, right now, actually, they have a webinar for the importance of mental health in sports.
Mhm.
But next week they're having an all-day clinic. And so the first portion of that, they are going to have a panel just talking about, empowering young women in sports. And then they're doing a flag football clinic as well. So I think that's a really cool space to be in the future. It's just like the growth of flag football and also having like young women play that sport. So those are some things that are coming up, but we also have a lot of exciting things planned out that I might not be able to share yet. But when the time comes, I'll let you know.
Yeah, that's great. That's wonderful to hear. I'm very happy to hear that for you. That's great. Congratulations. I
Thank
wanted
you.
to go back, revert a little bit. I know you said that this is your fourth week into your new role, correct? And
Correct.
so I'm curious if you could sort of paint us a picture at your previous role, where you worked at
Mhm.
University of Illinois, where I met you, and
Mhm.
sort of what you did at the University of Illinois and how it sort of transitioned into the role that you're at now.
Yeah, so the role at the University of Illinois, my title was the Diversity, Equity, Inclusion, and Belonging Fellow. But what I really liked about that was I got to work in the DEIB space, but then also in the student athlete development space. And I feel like that was really good because there are a lot of intersections there. So on the student athlete development side, I was able to lead a mentorship program that connected all of our student athletes with former alumni who were also student athletes at the university. Um, Being able to help, support like our Fighting Illini networking night, being able to introduce them to like new employers, work on their networking skills. It was also a lot of one-on-one sessions where I got to learn a lot about the student athletes and really help them identify their values, their passions, and work on their resume. And, how can we funnel those values and passions into a goal? Being able to help them, build out their whole LinkedIn profile and get them ready for life after sport. And then on the DEIB side, it's been really fun. Just being able to be a liaison to our cultural centers. We have student athletes from all different identities. So being able to, work with La Casa for our Latinx Heritage Month celebrations or working with our Bruce Nesbitt African American Cultural Center for our Black History Month celebrations and how can we highlight our student athletes? Like those kind of initiatives have been really fun. I've also been able to sit on the Diversity and Inclusion Committee. So there we've been able to kind of activate the strategic priorities that our university really focuses on. And so a lot of the work that I do, I was the co-chair of the community and belonging group. And so we provided a lot of recommendations for the recruitment and retention group. So thinking about, how can we make our hiring practices more equitable, but then also once we hire them, how can we maintain them, but then also make sure that we're building an inclusive space for them.
Mhm.
And then also with the education subcommittee as well. So thinking about, our student athletes, all of our employees, what kind of education do we want to give them to make sure that we all have that shared responsibility of building an inclusive and like warm environment for everyone to be in and to thrive in.
Mhm.
And so I think all of that has been really great. Another favorite thing that I do is I get to advise one of our student athlete affinity groups.
Mhm.
So I advise the Illini Allies, which is for our LGBTQIA student athletes.
Mhm.
And that's just been great to create like a sense of community and belonging for them.
Mhm.
And so, I had a really great 2 years here at Illinois. And so I'm just excited to be able to take everything that I've learned into my role at Columbia. Part of that role is being able to support student athlete affinity groups. So I'm excited to do that. The cool thing is when I was a student at Columbia, I started a student athlete affinity group. So it'll be nice to go back and see how I can support them now with like all of this knowledge that I've gained.
Yeah, that's wonderful. That's really cool. Is there any sort of favorite memory or favorite initiative that you were a part of when you were working in Illinois?
Oh, yeah. That's really hard to pick, but I would say one favorite initiative I did, this was probably my first year in October.
Hmm.
The NCAA, they had a diversity and inclusion social media campaign, and the
Hmm.
theme was about allyship. So rather than just sticking to social media, we wanted to create a whole event off of it. And we thought it would be great to do it with the affinity groups because there are three different identity groups. We have Empower for our student athletes of color, Illini Allies, our LGBTQIA student athletes, and then International Illini for our international student athletes. So it makes sense if we're talking about allyship, we all have these different identities. How can we be better allies for one another? And so the program that I created, it was like two parts. The first part was a Jeopardy game, because if you ever want to get student athletes like engaged, then you kind of have to make it competitive and make it a game. So the categories would be like, B, and DIB stands for belonging. And so it would have different resource centers on campus, and they would have to guess, like, based off of the clue, like what it is. So it would be good for them to know, for international student athletes, we have the International Student Scholar Services building. If they have any questions, there's the Asian American Cultural Center for our Asian American student athletes. So that was like one category. I think another category was like different definitions of like DEIB words that they should know, like such as intersectionality, being able to understand how all of these different identities intersect with one another.
Hmm.
Um, so we played that game. It was really fun. And then it kind of like primed their minds into thinking about like the topic that we were going to discuss for the night. And
Hmm.
then the second half of that, I had them think about their identities. So, what kind of marginalized identities do you hold, but also what kind of privileged identities do you hold?
Hmm.
Um, and also just thinking about how does that differ from, the perceptions of the identities that you hold and how others might perceive you.
Hmm.
And I think it was really cool because we all saw a commonality of, they all really hate being judged because on the outside, like people could tell that they were athletes. And so there would always be the stigma of like, oh, you don't deserve to be here. You just got here because of athletics, but you don't really care about academics. And it was just like a lot of like negative remarks. And so they realized that they all shared those common feelings. And so the next part of that was like, okay, knowing that even though we do have all of these different identities, there are still some commonalities that tie us together.
Hmm.
How can we better support one another in those areas? And so they made like commitments on how they can support one another, because they kind of shared stories of their experiences. Like for Illini Allies, they kind of said, hey, even though I am part of the LGBTQIA community, if you want to have a pride night, it shouldn't be on me. You could be a better ally by speaking up to the coach and, bringing that up. Or for Empower, they kind of said, well, if something happens to like a Black celebrity, I'm not the spokesperson to talk about it. Like, that's just not right. And so they kind of realized that they unconsciously did all of these things to one another. But, once they came to like that understanding of like how that affected the other person and then sharing those feelings of like negative remarks and stuff, I think they understood the power of allyship and how important it is to really uplift one another. And so for me, I think that was like one of my favorite programs to do because it goes beyond just like our normal shallow conversations, but really how can we be better individuals and like be better teammates to one another.
Yeah, that's a wonderful answer. Thank you. Thank you very much for sort of painting a picture of what that favorite memory was and what you were involved in. I'm curious, when I was listening to you speak, I heard a very common word that kept coming up is you kept saying community a lot. And I'm curious, is this sort of like your, I would say, I guess, bread and butter, air quotes? Like, do you focus mostly on community building? Is that sort of what you're heavily focused on, or is that more so like a personal passion area?
Yeah, I guess a little bit of both. Just
Mm.
because I feel like that kind of makes it feel like a sense of home, it's
Mhm.
just having that community, having people that can support you and uplift you. Because I feel like having community when you're going through really hard times is what's going to get you through life. And I think maybe that's why I'm so big on building community. And so, when we talk about the affinity groups, you have those are like minoritized groups in like a large institution. So to be able to build a community for them where they feel like there's a safe space where they can be authentically themselves and they don't have to hide who they are, I think is so important because that helps them be the best that they can be. And even that even helps them perform better athletically on the field or on the court is when they feel like they can be their true selves.
Mhm.
But then also community is also important because, we think about them competing as athletes. You have fans who show up and support them and pour into them. And for athletes, it's important for them to understand the platforms that they have and all of these people who are pouring into them, that it's also important to give back to their communities. And so that's why, we also try to facilitate a lot of community service outreach opportunities, whether it's
Mhm.
reading to elementary school kids or tackling like food insecurity and building like food bags for them elementary schools as well.
Yeah.
I feel like it's just like a two-way street of like we're all in this together and life is only going to be better if we work and support one another. So, yeah,
Mhm.
I guess community is like really important to me.
Yeah, that sort of leads me into a another question. When I was listening to you talk about community and this sort of, you brought it up, this sort of sense of belonging. I know within academics and within research, a very famous or well-known theory, which I'm sure you're very familiar with, is this theory of the sense of belonging, and that it
Mhm.
emphasizes that humans have this inherent need to feel connected, accepted, and valued within a group or
Mhm.
community. And I'm curious if you see this sort of theory that has been used widely in research. Do you see this sort of theory play out practically, like day to day, when you're doing your job and when you're, like, in the thick of it with these athletes?
Yeah, it's funny because you're reading like Yannick's research
Yeah.
in sense of belonging, and it talks about all these barriers. When you don't have that, you do feel isolated, you feel alone. And I think you do see that a lot, I guess, like in our everyday lives, because especially like with the freshmen when they're transitioning, it's very scary because you're off to a new place on your own. You don't have your parents, your community. You don't know really how to navigate this new college life where you have a lot more independence. And so, some of them, they do like heavily rely on their teammates, but it can also be very challenging because they do spend so much time with their teammates as well that if they're not there, that might crumble. So I feel like, every student athlete is different. But I think that's like one good thing about having that team is that you have a built-in community already where you feel like you belong because you have that shared
Mhm.
commonality of the sport that you do. But again, I think that's why the, athlete development piece is also so important into understanding who you are outside of an athlete so that you can find other pockets where
Mhm.
you might be interested in, other pockets of like where you might belong, so that you aren't just leaning on one community.
Yeah, yeah, that's great. That leads us right in, cohesively right into my next question that I have for you is, I'm coming from a sort of outsider's, somewhat semi-outsider's perspective. I was with underneath Dr. Yannick Kluk to begin my first semester, and I sort of got introduced to the area of DEI and athlete development. And I helped teach TA the sport and development course that talks a lot about athlete development and sport development. But I'm curious if you could sort of define or paint us a picture of or a grassroots understanding of what athlete development is, and sort of help me understand or help the listeners, understand or paint a picture of what athlete development is.
Yeah. I guess just to keep it simple, it's the holistic growth of an individual. And so, obviously we think about when they compete, that's them growing athletically, but then at the end of the day, like that comes to a stop. So we have to think about, who are they as individuals? And so being able to, like I said, talk about, help them identify, their values, things that they're
Mhm.
passionate about, so that we can get them thinking about like a career, thinking about, teaching them strategies to become more resilient, to become stronger with their mental health. And so it's really just being able to build them and build up their potential into being like the best human that they can possibly be,
Mhm.
so that when they do transition out of their sport, they're ready to take on what's coming next. They have the strategies to overcome like the challenges that they'll face. But it's just really helping them, I guess, like gain more exposure to all of these different areas because we talk about, well-being. And so that's like spiritual health, that's like social health, financial health, vocational. I think there's like 7 or 12 different like pillars of being, but
Hmm.
just making sure that they understand how to take care of themselves in all of these different aspects, like when it comes to nutrition, when it comes to their social relationships, all of these different things that affect their lives outside of the sport. It's really important that we empower them to, take charge of that and help them become adults because this is such a formative time of their life. So, yeah.
Yeah, I totally agree. I will connect a little bit to my previous experience. I mentioned this before we started recording, but I did compete for one year at the NAIA level, which obviously is nowhere near the D1 level, but I still competed for a year playing soccer at Ottawa University. And when you're talking about athlete development, I vividly remember thinking back to my time and how I sort of got engrossed in the identity of athlete or the identity of soccer player, and thinking of what athlete development is. I feel like it would be extremely or would have been extremely beneficial just at all levels to have sort of someone there to sort of help me understand as a young, like you said earlier, freshman coming in. I'm 18, I'm pursuing this sort of athletic dream, but
Mhm,
other than soccer and sports, like I'm also a human. Like I need to
mhm,
figure out how to socially, cohesively understand society outside of sport. And I
mhm,
struggled with that a lot during my first year playing. And after I got injured, I transferred away and I struggled with that even more because I relied so heavily on that sort of
mhm.
identity of I am athlete, like sort of I am Groot, sort of, where
Yeah,
the Guardians of the Galaxy, I am soccer, soccer is me kind of thing. And
yeah.
I, of course, sort of went through a couple of years like of an identity crisis because I didn't really know. It was always soccer, sport first, athletes, like workout regimens, all this stuff. And then I had this sort of free time where I had something else, and I was like, well, what do I do? I don't know.
Mhm,
Like I was never really taught
mhm.
or coached into any of this stuff. And I'm sure that's what a
Yeah.
lot of athletes experience and go through. And so that sort of leans into the next question. I'm curious, like your personal opinion, like why is athlete development important in your personal and
Mhm.
professional opinion?
Yeah. I have a comment and I was also going to ask
Yeah.
you this, but I guess it's so important because it really helps student athletes, I think, like find their voice and
Hmm.
find out how to use their voice, and figure out like who they are. Because I guess when I think about it, when I talk to these student athletes, they've been competing at such a young age and everything has been decided for them. This is the practice uniform you're going to wear today. This is like the food you're going to eat.
Mm.
So I feel like they have no sense of agency in their lives. And so the idea of like athlete development is so important is because they're learning to become like who they are outside of their sport. They're learning how to become leaders. They're just learning how to become people who can like learn how to advocate for themselves. And I think
Mhm.
that's really important because, they are young adults and we need to start treating them like young adults. So yeah, I wanted to ask you that, when you were competing at the collegiate level for your first year, did you feel like you had no sense of agency because everything was decided for you?
I think I did struggle with that a lot. I think if you would have asked me this when I was 18, I would have, probably denied and been like, oh, yeah, I'm totally fine. I'm cool.
Yeah.
I would have been okay. But now that I'm older and mature and I understand how young and naive I was, like pursuing athletics and sports, and I feel like I deeply yearned for that sort of agency because I
Mm,
think I unconsciously struggled with who I was
mm,
outside of sport, and I viewed myself as athlete first. And now
mm,
that the subsequent years of after I transferred away, I took that identity away, and I was like,
mm,
well, who am I? Who am I now? Like, what do I like? I don't have sport anymore. What do I
mm,
do? Do I party all day? Do I do academics all day? I don't know. What do I had no idea, and I really struggled with that. And I think having someone there, like someone in your role,
mm,
to sort of help me understand that, sport obviously, sure, sport can be life, but there's also life outside of sport, and it's not,
Mhm.
not all as extremely important as one athlete places on themselves. And I think it's very beneficial and crucial that
Mhm.
athletes understand that you're also human and you have
Mhm.
interests and hobbies and you have these sort of, identities that you mentioned that, need to be talked about. And I think it's very beneficial to just communicate these things. But I will say when I was younger, I would have denied
Yeah.
and rejected all of these things just because I think, as a young 18-year-old, athletic scholarship, like, yeah, I'm sport first. That's me. I'm sport this, sport that, athletics first. And I think it was really hard for my young, immature sort of athlete first brain to sort of comprehend these things. And it would have been, like I said, it would have been nice to have an outside perspective, a professional coming in saying, hey, it's not always this. There's
Yeah.
things outside of that. And that was a
Yeah.
wonderful question. Thank you for asking that. And that sort of leads me into my next question. I'm curious if you could sort of paint us a picture of what your daily schedule or your daily life looks like. We could hit on maybe more Illinois since that's where you were the longest, and since you're currently working virtual at Columbia. So I'm
Yeah.
curious at Illinois, what was sort of the day in the life? What did that look like for you?
Every day was different, honestly. I think the
Mhm.
one constant might be just my meetings with student athletes.
Mhm.
Sometimes they would just pop in and ask for some help with maybe their resume or their LinkedIn. But then that would also just strike up some conversations about how they're doing
Mhm.
in life and how I can support them. But every day would be different just because there's so many things going on. But I guess the thing about college athletics is that it's cyclical. So, around August, like we'll have our welcome back orientation programs. We know that we're going to go into our networking nights. I have to start my mentorship program. So every day looks different depending on like the time of the year. But I think a lot of it would be just meeting people and like having those meetings of, what do we want this program or this event or initiative to look like and just kind of building it out. I think that's one thing I probably spent a lot of time doing at Illinois is building relationships because I think some things that people don't realize is how important getting that buy-in is and nurturing those relationships, When I first got to Illinois, I met with all of the directors of the cultural houses and I asked them, what was the relationship with athletics been like? How can we collaborate and bring you all more into our space? And so from there, we've had a lot of cool initiatives like for the Asian American Cultural Center, we've never celebrated Lunar New Year before at an athletic competition. So, nurturing that relationship and bringing them into our space. They tabled, and we were able to get, a lot of cool like little snacks and treats to share with our fans that came into those games. Like, this is what Lunar New Year is about. These are the countries that celebrate it. So giving them like a piece of that, but then also during the games, being able to highlight our student athletes who do celebrate Lunar New Year. But being able to have those meetings where you build those relationships with all of these people, you also get more buy-in into the things that you do. And so I think that's also why I spend a lot of time in those meetings with student athletes, being able to understand who they are more, kind of like what they're interested in and building those relationships with them so that when an opportunity comes around, I'm like, hey, I think you would be interested in this. This is something that you want to do. And they're like, yes, because they trust me. So I think like a cool moment of that, there was one student athlete that I had, he's a men's gymnast. He would come into my office pretty often because he really wanted to get an internship, but he didn't know what he wanted to do. So we would work on, the LinkedIn, his resume, but I would also just spend time getting to know him. And we had a micro internship with Eli Lilly that was coming up. And I was just like, hey, I think you would be really good for this because you're interested in doing sales. This is kind of like a precursor for you to understand if this is more of like the space that you want to be in. So it worked with his schedule because it was only for a month long. But then after he did that, he was like, oh, this was like super helpful. I think I actually want to go into consulting and stuff. And so
Mhm.
I feel like every time that I tell him, hey, you should join my mentorship program or you should do this, he just trusts me and he does it and he gets a lot out of it.
Mhm.
So yeah, a lot, I guess like my day to day is just really relationship building and helping to get that buy-in from, coaches to be on board with the programs that we're doing, getting student athletes
Mhm.
to trust the work that we're doing and see the value in it because a lot of them might want to go pro, so they have to start thinking about other options, thinking about our campus partners and we don't want to be siloed just because we're an athletic department. So how can we bring them into our space, but also bring our athletes into their spaces as well? Because you don't want them to stay in this bubble. So I don't know if that really answers your question, but I guess like a lot of it is like relationship building and just having meetings and like just executing, I guess.
Yeah, that's great. It's sort of actually one thing you said specifically got me really curious. You said that to get buy-in from coaches. I'm curious, like in your day-to-day,
Mhm.
do you see pushback from coaches based off of some of the initiatives that you want to do?
Mm. I think I've been fortunate where I haven't gotten a lot of pushback in terms of the initiatives that I specifically wanted to do.
Hmm.
Um, and I think some of that, I was like very intentional about being visible, like in my
Hmm.
first year. So we have like a sport liaison model, because there's 500 athletes at the University of Illinois, and I can't service all of them. So we would split them up, in our student athlete development team. And so
Hmm.
I would have like volleyball, men and women's gymnastics, golf, and stuff. But for the teams that I did have, I would show up to those practices and make sure that I was visible, introducing myself to the student athletes that were there, to the coaches, and just, build that relationship. And
Hmm.
so I feel like that really helped because I think one thing that I wanted to do was for Women's History Month. And I wanted to work with all of the teams and kind of do different videos, that would touch on, the importance of being able to highlight like women athletes. And so that like for coaches and students, they didn't have to participate in that, but me sending an email to the coaches, they're like, oh yeah, we would love to talk about, what's the best thing that my female athlete coach has taught me, or like, what advice would I tell my younger self? And so I think being able to build that relationship, they're more welcoming and inviting me into like their practices. They're like, yeah, come by, stop by anytime. And it's just like, whatever initiative that I want to do, they find a way to like make it work with me. So I feel like I was very privileged in that sense.
Yeah, that sounds great. I was really curious when you said that, but it also reminds me back to another thing you mentioned. Did you said college sports is cyclical, and we know that the university schedule is from August to December, January to May. I'm curious, what does summer look like for you in these upcoming summer months? I'm curious if you could paint me a
Yeah.
picture of what that sort of looks like.
Yeah. I mean, I guess a typical academic year is August to May, but it doesn't end for us. I think
Yeah,
those
we
are probably,
know. Yeah, we're
yeah, those are heavy planning periods for the year. But for us, we have RST 118, which is a transition to college course. And so
Mhm.
for our mid-year transfers who come in during the January, like spring semester, they've had one semester here, but we have an orientation program for them that kind of introduces them to the resources they have on campus and helps them, identify where they can go. Like we have guest speakers, like people from the Career Center or the Leadership Center to talk about, what kind of leader are you, thinking about a career, helping them work on like a SWOT analysis and stuff.
Mhm.
So they have that orientation program, during the summer, but then we also have a lot of experiential learning opportunities that we get to take some of our students to. So one that just recently ended was the Black Student Athlete Summit. This time it was in Chicago, but we took six of our student athletes up there. And it's a 3 to 4 day experience, just full of, student athletes and professionals who are, obviously Black, but they get to learn about different workshops or topics that are very specific to their identity. I
Mhm.
think one of the topics that they had was just, being able to navigate the workspace, when it comes to like your hair type and things like that. Just kind of showing them how to be their authentic selves, like in the workspace. They get to learn about, DEIB legislation, how that's affecting them. Also like Pro Day, being able to learn from a lot of industry experts. And so that's like a really cool summit. There's also the Athlete Activism Summit that we take our students to. And so I went on this last year, but it's another, I believe, like 2 to 3 day trip that's put on by Athlete Ally, which is a nonprofit organization that works to end like homophobia and transphobia, like within sports.
Mhm.
So I learned so much, about, um, people that are part of that community, and just hearing like their stories. And for me, being able to understand how I can support them better, that was just like a life-changing experience. But another one that I really liked was I think another privilege that we have is being part of the Big Ten Conference. And so they have a couple of unique experiences for our students to do. One of it was the Big Life Selma to Montgomery trip.
Hmm.
So we took a couple of student athletes to Alabama where they learned about the U.S. Civil Rights Movement. They got to hear from speakers that fought alongside Rosa Parks and Martin Luther King Jr. We visited museums that touched on the Atlantic slave trade and everything. We did a community service project, building book bags to give back to the community.
Hmm.
And it was just really good for them to be able to learn about, their history, their culture. And I think for us, it's really important because there's so much to learn outside of the classroom. And so to take them to these experiential learning opportunities where they get to learn and experience and live it, it's just like really cool. And I think that helps give you like a higher return on interest. For example, we had a football student athlete who went on the summer trip. He came back and he's now like a SAC member. And then he wanted to go on the Black Student Athlete Summit trip. So he wanted to go. But I think it's like what I'm talking about earlier is like you show them these experiences and they really see the value in it and it makes them more involved with all of the things that we have going on. So some of them have become like empower leaders. They've been part of SAC and they're just like doing a lot more because they really value, everything that we have to offer them that really nurtures their holistic growth outside of their athletic identity.
That's wonderful. It really reminds me of my time when I first before I started my PhD. I went to the NCAA Inclusion Forum with Dr. Yannick Kluk and shout out Solomon Siskind,
Hmm.
Kevin Galuli as well. I'm pretty sure you were in attendance. Were you at
Yep.
that one? And yeah, as well. And
Yeah.
so there's a couple of other students from Illinois that were there as well. It was really cool to sort of open my eyes because where I'm coming from and where I came from just within sport management and things of that nature and just athletics, I sort of never really understood or was introduced to the behind the scenes work of athlete development and sort of how individuals or departments sort of actually develop athletes to begin with. And it was really
Hmm.
cool to go to this inclusion forum and hear from all of these voices. And, at that inclusion forum, it was the first time I actually realized there was a international athlete on stage talking about this was last year. It was after the NIL bill passed, and he was like, "Yeah, actually, I'm an advocate right now. I'm a D1 college, basketball player, but my visa disallows me from doing any NIL work because it violates the visa or the visa agreements, and he can't work, basically like air quotes work
Hmm.
with NIL and can't make any money off of that. And he's trying to, I forgot his name and where he played basketball at, but that really stuck with me. And, all of these interesting perspectives and, identities and interactions and things that go into sport that I sort of was, I guess, ignorant to before I showed up or just wasn't really, I guess, introduced to. The program
Yeah.
that I went to we really didn't talk about athlete development. It was more, I guess, business focused, and it was more so how do you drive revenue through sport. But I really do see the importance of understanding how to develop athletes, and it's really, really cool to hear your perception and hear your experiences. Which sort of transitions us into a small little halftime here, and so we'll take maybe about a 5 to 10 second break, and we'll sort of come back from this break and talk a little bit more about your specific experience and sort of your personal perception and consumption of sports. We'll be right back in a couple seconds. Okay, thanks everyone. Welcome back from the short little halftime. I hope everybody enjoyed the first half where Mary and I talked about her current role, her role at Columbia, her previous role at Illinois, what specifically is athlete development, why it's important, and sort of a look into her daily life, what that sort of was, what the daily schedule was. And I'm really excited about
Can I
this
make a
back.
comment to your previous comment?
Yeah, of course.
Like, I actually really like what you said. Just talking about a lot of like sport management majors. I
Hmm.
think that's why I wish more people knew about this because I think for
Hmm.
me, I'm not about generating revenue or anything. And so
Hmm.
you don't know what you don't know. I didn't know that sports and student athlete development existed until like I was in it. But I think it's so important because like you said, when you're talking about the international student athlete, people are really against like the idea of DEI, but then you think about it, like if we're thinking about like the E in DIB, it's like equity, and talking about how can we make things more equitable if we're thinking about like NIL for student athletes, but
Hmm.
international student athletes can't get that. Or knowing that, some of their identities, some of them are like first generation student athletes. They've never
Hmm.
navigated the college space before. How can we meet them where they are and make sure that we're closing those gaps for them? I think, I think you mentioned earlier there's like 500,000 student athletes in the NCAA, and it's
Hmm.
like they all come from like such different backgrounds, and it's so important to really honor their identities, but also make sure that we're making things like equitable for all of them. And so
Yeah.
I wish there was more of an emphasis on, sport, social impact, and like student athlete development more so than the business side of things.
Yeah, and what's really interesting, I think a lot of this is my personal opinion. I think a lot of business programs fail to understand, even though there is a positive impact or a beneficial sort of direction or perception looking at specific revenues and things like that. But in order to drive said revenues, individuals or fans or athletes need to be intrigued. They need to achieve this sort of sense of belonging. They need to have some sort of societal or sociological well-being or cohesion
Mhm.
in order for that revenue to take place. Because in my mind, in my previous experience with sport, the first episode I spoke with my dad about how the Rams left in 2015, and now I feel no sense of belonging to the NFL. I feel no loyalty. I feel no community towards the NFL.
Yeah.
And so
Yeah.
now, in a business perspective, that is a failure. And that's also a failure on the sociological perspective. But how do you sort of rebuild that? How do you rebuild that sort of sense of belonging? How do you sort of approach these sociological things that impact
Mhm.
business perspectives and sort of drive revenue? And I think that's one thing that business programs fail to think about is the
Mhm.
underlining meaning behind the revenue and behind why people
Yeah.
buy a ticket. Is it because they love the sport, or is it because they love the people and they love the
Mhm.
fact that they have this sort of sense of belonging that you're talking about within
Yeah.
athlete development?
Yeah. And I think it goes like both ways. If you want to drive revenue, it's yes, you are doing the athlete development side. And I think that's why we talk about, identity building and being able to let them know who they are outside of their sport. Because then for the audience, it's that storytelling that the media should be doing that really makes us feel connected with those athletes. Because I feel like, I'm a big fan of women's sports, and I feel like I don't know if you watched The Unrivaled this past season, but
Mm.
it was just like a more personal glimpse inside of, the athletes that were watching, being able to see one of them learn how to cook for the first time and she's just kind
Mm.
of a disaster in the kitchen, or seeing like their jokes and their personalities of who they are off the court. I feel like that's what makes me get invested, and I'm like cheering for them, knowing that some of them struggle with mental health issues. And I'm just like, okay, I can relate to that, and them just being vulnerable. So I feel like applaud to the athletes who, understand like the power of their voice and they use it and they, talk about those things. And then it's also like for the audience to be able to connect with it. And I think that can really help drive a lot of revenue or just growth in a lot of professional leagues, is if you
Mhm.
know how to accurately like tell these stories of the different people that you're trying to make a profit off of.
Yeah. Yeah, I really agree. I think that's one of the things that the sport management or the SM degree or discipline I think needs to
Mhm.
sort of get a hold on. I think there's a lot of debate. I spoke about this in a previous episode of where to place this sport management degree and this sport management discipline. And I feel like a
Mhm.
lot of individuals want to place it in business because they see the business implications. But as we're sort of hitting on, is there's a lot of things behind the scenes that won't drive revenue if if the job that you do doesn't exist. Like that wouldn't help individuals feel this social cohesion. It wouldn't help individuals feel a sense of belonging. And like
Mm,
even within like a group of fans, like for a pro team, if they don't feel this sort of sense of cohesion or belonging, like that revenue will go away. It doesn't, it's not going to help just to sort of sell to people. You have to understand what sport does to people and why. And I think that's
mm,
one thing that needs to be talked about, I think in all within every SM major.
mm,
I just would also say within every major, just because I think it's very important to understand how just communities and societies as a whole become sort
mm,
of like drive communities and become together and create this sort of sense of belonging with one another.
mm.
I know we got a little bit, we snowballed a little bit and got off topic, but I really loved that topic. That was awesome. I want to go back to a little bit on your the pros and cons of working in college sports. And I'm curious, if you
Mm.
could sort of paint a picture of, what's sort of positive, negative working in the collegiate sport atmosphere.
Yeah, I would say a big pro for me is
Mhm.
knowing that I'm able to help positively impact the lives of the student athletes.
Mhm.
I think it's such a great feeling when you see that aha moment go off for them of like, oh, I can do that, or I have the skills to do that. Because you know, f- small example, a lot of them don't think that they have a lot of skills that are transferable in the workplace, but we talk about, you have strong time management skills because you're juggling like practice, film, competition, academics, all of that. You have great like teamwork skills because you're on a team, so you have a lot of like communication, cultural competency skills, things like that. But then also just helping them identify different paths that they could pursue. So helping them like have that aha moment is really good. And then I think just also, we keep going back to this, but helping them do other things outside of sport. I
Mhm.
had a women's tennis player who, the very first day I met her, she was just like, I'm going to go pro. I'm going to go pro. She didn't want to participate in any of the activities that we did. But for the Women's History Month, I collaborated with the Women's Resources Center. And I feel like this is like another one of my favorite events, but we bring them into that space and we just have a very vulnerable conversation. This
Mhm.
year, it was about, how to maximize yourself because too often women feel the need to minimize who they are to make others feel comfortable. They feel like they can't take up space in the workplace or in their lives. And so this session was like, let's have an open discussion on it. Let's talk about strategies you can use to really empower yourself, to really, have the confidence to take up space.
Mhm.
So I asked that women's tennis player to be a discussion leader for it and kind of talk about her experience. And she was like, that didn't feel like an hour and a half at all. I had such a great time. I really liked
Mhm.
it. And just doing that, she brought in a freshman too. And I think the freshman will come in the next year. But it's just connecting those moments for them of like, this is why it's so important. I think that's like my biggest joy and being able to build those relationships. Um, Last year, one of my student athletes, she was graduating. She There was like a speech about adversity, and she said, I went through so much adversity this year, but every time I stepped into your office, I knew that I would be okay.
Mhm.
And that just touched my heart. So I
Mhm.
think like the biggest pro is being able to really watch these young people grow into who they are, into leaders, just finding out, who they are, what they want to do, what they want to be in life.
Mhm.
And also just wanting to share that moment with you. And knowing that you had a part in it. So just being able to have that positive impact, I think is just like a huge pro for me. And for me, something that's really important in my work is finding something that's fulfilling and meaningful. So I feel like this is perfect for it.
Mhm.
I would say like on the con side, you don't always get people who understand like the value of like what you're doing, So
Mhm.
sometimes like student athletes who do just want to go pro or whatever, it's a lot more like pulling teeth and trying to get them on board.
Mhm.
Um, but I think that's fine because it's like, okay, like I have a challenge now, like I
Mhm.
gotta work and nurture this relationship. Um, and then also just with the future of, or I guess like just college athletics in general, the landscape is always changing.
Mhm.
So that's like pro and con because then it's good because you got to stay on your toes. You got to, be proactive, think about what's coming next and how you can prepare for that. But
Hmm.
then it's also just like if you think about like our current situation right now, it's like a little bit scary with what's going on.
Hmm.
And then I would say, I don't know if this is like taboo, but a big con for me is just the pay in college athletics. I
Hmm.
feel like there's a huge misconception. Oh, you work in sports, you make so much money, but that's really not the case. Not if unless you're like a coach or an AD, us being in our student support roles, you really don't make a lot and it's tough. But I think that's why you have to think about the why and what you do. And for me, my why is the student athletes, and that's what keeps me going. So it
Yeah.
kind of like makes up for it.
Yeah, yeah, that reminds me of a famous quote that drives the passion that I have for working in sport. It was if you love what you do, you'll never work a day in your life. And like
Mhm.
I remember my very first job. It's really funny. My very first job in sport was an athletic specialist for the city of Memphis, and I
Mhm.
I actually did the math. My salary for the city of Memphis is almost the exact same or just slightly less than what I'm getting as a PhD student for my stipend. And it's like it's really funny to me because I feel like a lot of I know we're getting a little off track, but I love this topic of there's this sort of perception, oh, you work in sport, you're probably making a bunch of money, but unfortunately, that it's usually long hours and low pay. But
Mhm.
the impact
Mhm.
and the sort of connectedness, the sort of community building that you have, in
Mhm.
my mind, substitutes and pays for that tenfold. And a lot of the relationships I made when I worked in that job I did in Memphis,
Mhm.
I didn't care that I wasn't making a ton of money because I I helped build sport within the community of
Yeah.
Memphis, and much like you're doing or did in Illinois, and what now we'll be doing at Columbia, you're sort of building this community that
Mhm.
it's just one of those things. But as time goes on, I'm sure things will change, and I'm hoping that more notoriety will come to individuals that sort of, I guess, air quotes, work in the trenches of sport, behind the
Yeah.
scenes of sort of, building these athletes, building sport, developing the athletes themselves. And I'm
Mhm.
curious that sort of transitions me into a very curious question for you is now that you've worked in the industry that you've worked in and had the experiences that you've had, I'm curious in your personal opinion, do you think your perception of sports has changed? Do you think the way that you consume sports has changed? Do you think it's stayed the same? Do you view it in a different light? I'm just curious what your thought is.
Yeah, I guess being in the trenches and just being surrounded by sports so much, it's definitely changed. I think I I guess like before, I've only competed at the high school level, and
Mhm.
so I, obviously did a lot of other things outside of sports, but speaking with these student athletes, you hear about how that was all they did growing up. And so I guess that helped me understand like why sports is like their whole identity and who they are because they spend so much time into that. And so I think that makes me feel like a little bit more empathetic. When I try to ask them to do all of these things, it is like hard for them because they do spend a lot of time with all of these different activities like related to their sports. But I think it also makes me more invested in it. I think knowing like I guess like having a better understanding of sports, understanding like non-revenue generating sports versus
Mhm.
like revenue generating sports. I just like it makes me want to go support, the non-revenue generating sports more. Just being able to build those connections with those athletes, like, gymnastics, for example. I'm like, this is such an amazing skill to have. And I feel like I never really got into it before, but now building those relationships, I'm like so into it. But then also, I think in doing my research, I so I started a student athlete affinity group at Columbia and it was like voice and sport. And so for the first session, I kind of talked to my student athletes and pushed them like, hey, thinking about, the systems that you're in, just because this is what you're used to, doesn't mean that it's always equal or fair. So we did like a Kahoot of sticky statistics.
Mhm.
So there were things about like, how much media coverage do women athletes get, even though they make up half of the population, it's only like 3%. Or like, what is the gender pay gap between, Diana Taurasi, the most highly paid WNBA player, compared to Rocky the mascot? He was making like 600,000 as opposed to like 200,000. I think doing my research and learning more about all of those things about how there's a huge inequity within like female male sports,
Mhm.
I think has made me like even more invested into being a better fan for women's sports. And so, showing up to their games, making sure to share, when they do have events going on, being able to buy their merch or their gear to help support them. I feel like just having a better understanding of all the nuances within like professional and collegiate sports, I try to be a better fan in that sense,
Mhm.
just because they do go through a lot, and it's so hard being in the public eye and going through a lot of scrutiny that I feel like I have to be a nice fan and just like a good person to support them. That
Yeah.
was a very roundabout answer.
Oh, that's
But
great. Yeah, I love hearing your like experience and your perception. I'm curious, like, is there ever a time that you're watching something on television or things of that nature, like, and you think to yourself, like, you have a thought to your head, oh, I think this way because of the job I do or the things I do. Does that understand what I'm asking? I feel like there's times where
yeah,
I'm watching a
yeah,
sport and I'm like, oh, like the psychology of fans are doing the blah blah blah, and I like it changes the way that I think of it. Like through the research that I'm doing, the things I'm interested in, I now think of watching sport. Oh, well, why is this group of fans protesting? That would be a cool research idea instead of just
yeah.
appreciating the game. I'm curious, does that ever occur or happen when you're watching sport?
Yeah, I think something cool that we do at Illinois, we have the I Matter campaign, and this is
Hmm.
to combat like social media harassment for our
Hmm.
student athletes. I think especially with the rise of sports betting, you see a lot of more negativity and just ugly comments online towards the athletes.
Hmm.
And so, I feel like, being a big fan of like, the WNBA per se, or even just like any sports, you
Hmm.
see so much negativity and backlash, and it's just like you guys are terrible people. I think this is like a controversial hot take is like the shit talking that's like a part of the sports culture. But
Yeah.
then for me, I'm like these are humans at the end of the day because I see some of those hate comments like towards my student athletes, and I'm like, this is like this is like a part of like what they do, but you do
Hmm.
realize that they are human at the end of the day, be
Hmm.
careful with what you're saying just because some of the threats were just like terrible. And I think
Hmm.
the other day I saw the WNBA released No Place for Hate kind of campaign, and I was
Hmm.
like, okay, cool. That's similar to, what we have with the I Matter campaign, but then
Yeah.
with like some of the games, you're still hearing some racist comments. So it's just like, how are you guys gonna hold the fans like more accountable, And so one of the things that we try to do in the I Matter campaign is to provide more education to our fans of like
Hmm.
this is what social media stability looks like, and just like, being respectful online, being able to share more of our athletes' stories so that it humanizes our athletes for them so that they don't feel that they shouldn't, say all these bad things about them.
Yeah.
So like things like that have kind of impacted the way that I see sports. And
Yeah.
I'm like, oh, this is like a really cool initiative that we do. What do they have at the pro level or vice versa? If
Yeah.
it's at the pro level, how can we bring it to college athletics?
Yeah, it's really interesting. One sort of thought I had that popped in my head is when you're seeing a lot of fan hate and things of that nature. It was really interesting that I thought of. I don't know why I thought of this, but like it'd be interesting to see like the individuals, the I guess sort of air quotes keyboard warriors that sort of hide
Mhm.
behind the keyboard and social media. They'll say everything they want through a DM, but it's like if you flip it on its head and be like, well, if that same individual was working at a job and they missed a deadline, like an individual misses a free throw and they, say, "Oh, you suck" in their DMs. Like, what if the same person missed a deadline and someone
Mhm.
DM'd them and said, "You're terrible at your job" or whatever, things like that. And I'm very positive. I would argue that they would probably not appreciate that. They probably
Yeah.
wouldn't be happy that they're receiving this sort of
Mhm.
hate. And so I think what is wild to me is I feel like people think it's okay to just
Mhm.
yell profanities because it's sport, they're athletes,
Mhm.
whatever. But at the end of the day,
Yeah.
like what if we DM'd you and you missed a deadline and we said, we DM'd you and said you are terrible, like, or things like that. And I think
Yeah.
it's just those things that people don't think about that, again, like they're human at the end of the day. Like
Hmm.
nobody's perfect,
Yeah.
like constantly
But
every single day.
having
Like,
having empathy is so important, you know?
mhm. Yeah.
And so I think that's also something that we try to teach our students. And I think a big part of that is perspective taking, being able to
Mhm.
understand your teammates' perspective, even though you
Yeah.
might not relate, but you know, what's that phrase? Like take a step into their shoes
Hmm.
or
Walk a mile in their shoes.
walk
Yeah.
around their shoes. Yeah,
Yeah.
So yeah, I think building empathy is so important, and I feel like sports can do that.
Mhm.
And I think again, this is why, that sense of belonging and community building is so important because I feel like if you have people who are supporting you, who are pouring their love into you, you
Mhm.
don't have a low self-esteem. You don't feel the need to, project onto these athletes and say all these negative things. Like
Mhm.
if you are filled with love, you're gonna like project love out. So I think
Mhm.
that's why it's so important to build those communities.
Yeah, yeah, I really agree. I really, really enjoyed the conversation. This sort of ends on my final question. I'm curious, like, what future dreams or future goals that you have? Maybe, do you aspire to continue to work in college sports, or do you have a sort of ambitious goal? I'm curious what plans you have, or anything of
Yeah.
that nature.
I don't really want to stick with college sports.
Mhm.
There's a lot of cool social impact projects that I really
Mhm.
want to be a part of. For example, the Adidas Breaking Barriers campaign. Are you familiar with that?
I'm not actually, no.
Okay. So it's breaking barriers. So the focus here is like working with young girls. They're gonna do research on like, what are barriers that prevent them from participating in sports, and then they'll develop, programs and solutions to help reduce those barriers. And so I guess that's like kind of a combination of like what you're doing is, conducting the research on like, what prevents specific athletes to participate in sports
Mhm.
or like how do they feel about things, and then what can we do to make sports more accessible or like more better for that person.
Mhm.
So they have like a lot of workshops, and they have like a lot of cool initiatives to help build up their capacity as like leaders, doing a lot of like empowerment, raising self-esteem kind of things.
Mhm.
So I think that's like something I really want to do because I like a job where I can be creative. And so being able
Mhm.
to think about what are fun or cool ways where we can teach these things to these young athletes. And I think also with my degree in international and public affairs, you think about there's like refugee athletes as well, it's really hard when you get displaced, but sports is really important because it can help you have a sense of community when you're not in your home.
Mhm.
And so I guess like my goal is to work with these like athletes of different types, not just like professional or collegiate athletes, but anybody can be an athlete. Just
Mhm.
thinking about that, how can we use sports to, better their lives?
Mhm.
I guess it's a simple way to put it. That's what I really want to do.
Yeah, that sounds cool. Do you think you may want to transition to the nonprofit sector and work with the nonprofit that you just got elected to the board? Is that another sort of, I guess, avenue
Yeah.
or thought?
Mhm. Yeah, I think for sure that's definitely one avenue. So I think that's why I might want to go more in the nonprofit space and then
Mhm.
definitely work, being on the board for this nonprofit, I think will help me understand if this is something that I truly want to do, but also give me
Mhm.
the experience to, do what I actually want to do.
Yeah.
Um, I think another route is also potentially sports diplomacy.
Mhm.
Um, I think that's also interesting as well, of like how can we use sports to bridge, relations with different countries.
Mhm.
Build that community and like cross-cultural understanding. So
Yeah.
I feel like that's a good thing about me going to Columbia is I'll be in New York and there's a lot of different pathways. If I, for some reason, wanted to stick with college athletics for a couple more years or doing professional sports, there's a lot of professional leagues over there. A lot of nonprofits, the Women's Sports Foundation is over there, but then the UN headquarters is also there too if I did want to do sports diplomacy.
Mhm.
So I feel like I have a lot of options.
Yeah. Yeah, it's really
Yeah.
cool. One random incident that popped in my head when you talked about sport diplomacy. This is my personal take, my personal opinion, but I do believe that sport is inherently political and in and of itself.
Mhm.
Like when you think of the Four Nations tournament that just happened, the hockey tournament that occurred a while back, and during one of the games, I think it was between the U.S. and Canada.
Mhm.
The both anthems were played because it was Canada playing the U.S. and U.S. individuals or fans booed the Canadian anthem, and then Canadian fans booed the U.S. anthem solely
Mhm.
because of the current governmental relations between the U.S. and Canada. And so it's really interesting when you think of sports and how, like you're saying, this sort of diplomatic sort of approach to sport, it is very political, and I think it is very politically charged, and it's really interesting to see how individuals use sport as this sort of like landscape or sort of platform for
Mhm.
diplomacy, and that they do things through sport, and then sport then
Mhm.
produces things in the back end, and it's really interesting to think about those things. But yeah, I really enjoyed our conversation today. I learned a ton about athlete development. I'm really happy that you took the time out of your schedule to speak with me. I'm really grateful that you sort of influenced my thought on athlete development, and you helped me understand a more holistic understanding of what athlete development really is. And I really loved
Mhm.
hearing your experiences and your perspectives. So I really appreciate your time. And I really hope everyone else enjoyed the episode. So thank you very much for joining, and thanks again for your time. I really hope you enjoyed the conversation too. So
Yeah, thank you for having me on and letting me share, my insights and experiences. I really
yeah,
enjoyed talking with you.
of course, thank you very much. Hope everyone enjoyed the episode.